Our first presenter of the day is Dr. Tammy Nemeth, Strategic Energy and ESG. Dr. Tammy Nemeth is originally from Saskatchewan. She's a strategic energy and ESG analyst based in the United Kingdom. Her consulting company is a strategic energy and ESG analyst based in the United Kingdom. Her consulting company, ESG Squared Insight, offers bespoke research, analysis, and insights to help organizations understand the overlapping challenges of energy, security, geopolitics, and environmental social governance. ESG Squared is the name of the company. Dr. Nemeth has a PhD in history from the University of British Columbia and was a guest lecturer of the geopolitics of energy and the environment at the University of Germany. Tammy is also joining us here today via video conferencing for a remote presentation. So if you could just turn your heads to the screens on either side of the stage to see her presentation. And this presentation is sponsored by Real Agriculture.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I want to say thank you to Chapman Pearson and the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association for the invitation to speak with you today. I really wish I could be there with you all in person rather than so far away here in the UK. And you know, although I live in England right now with my husband, we're both from Saskatchewan. And we're looking forward to having a great visit with our cattle and neighbors when we're back home in about a month's time. Thank you again for inviting me to share with you this morning a significant development, and I would call this headwind, that will fundamentally alter how you do or are able to do your business. The next slide, please. So if you'd like more information about what I'm about to talk to you today, about the proposed sustainability financial disclosures, please take a look at my report. It dissects and gets into far more detail than I'm going to talk about today on some of the more problematic aspects of the new standard and the implications, not just for the oil and gas industry, which is my specialization, because they're most affected, but also for agriculture and livestock users. If you scan the QR code on this page, it will take you to the report, and it's available for download on my website. Next slide, please. To start, I would just like to apologize in advance for the number of acronyms that I'll be using today. Unfortunately, it's unavoidable. In trying to understand who's responsible for these new standards, it's like peeling back an onion. There's layers upon layers of networks and organizations involved, and I've done my best to try and simplify where this all came from and how they are interconnected. Currently, companies can voluntarily provide information on their sustainability or environmental, social, and governance record, or ESG, and how it affects their operations. In some cases, you may even be offered a better interest rate by your bank if you provide a sustainability statement or some kind of sustainability transition plan. Some larger organizations may even voluntarily fill out the Carbon Disclosure Project 161-page questionnaire. The information is usually intended for investors, and companies aren't liable for their statements because it's voluntarily given. But after 7 years of determined action by Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg and a number of others to support the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, there's a new global baseline for mandatory sustainability and climate-related financial disclosures being developed.
has an opportunity to consider them, then these guidelines will be adjusted accordingly for mandatory implementation in alignment with the ISSB standards. So today, I would like to share with you what's coming down the pipeline for Canada, how it's relevant to you, and the potential actions you can take. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'll give an overview of how this started, where it came from. Next, I'll explain the origins of the ISSB and the introduction of the first two disclosure standards. Then I'll cover three key issues in the standards that will impact your operations. And then in conclusion, I'll suggest why you should care and what can be done about it. Next slide, please. So as part of my ongoing research to understand the various actions that have taken place to frustrate Canada's oil and gas and resource industries, one thing that stood out for me was the effort of Mark Carney, Mike Bloomberg, and others within the financial industry to choke financing or to divest from large emitter companies. Divestment campaigns were originally led by environmental organizations, and that began back in about 2012. This was key to raising public awareness about finance and softening the public to accept more official changes, which of course began as voluntary. Now in 2015, around the time of creating the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, yes, another acronym, Mark Carney said, and I quote, "More needs to be done to develop disclosures around the carbon intensity of different assets," end quote. So by 2017, a voluntary reporting framework was introduced, and since then it's been undergoing various modifications. By 2021, and the buildup towards the post-pandemic climate meeting known as COP26 in Glasgow, the UK, New Zealand, Canada, Hong Kong, and Switzerland made TCFD reporting mandatory for certain larger size companies. Carney was appointed advisor to the UK Prime Minister for COP26, and he launched the private finance agenda to drive a whole economy transition, where he stated that the purpose was to ensure that every financial decision takes climate change into account. This became known as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ. Banks, insurers, and investment firms formed alliances under this umbrella and pledged to phase down the emissions on their books to net zero by 2050. You may have heard that some of the world's largest insurers have recently pulled out of this alliance. But the banks have stayed in, and the top 8 banks in Canada are members of this GFANZ. In his speech during the COP26 launch, Carney also stated directly the need for a great transformation of the global economy. And I quote, "Achieving net zero will require a whole economy transition. Every company, every bank, every insurer, and every investor will have to adjust their business models," end quote. And it was here at this Glasgow Climate Conference that the International Sustainability Standards Board was born. Next slide, please. So how did this start? What exactly is the ISSB? Well, at COP26 in Glasgow, the ISSB was established within the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, or IFRS. The IFRS has been creating global accounting standards since 2003, and these standards are required in 140 jurisdictions around the world, including Canada. The purpose of the ISSB is to create a new global baseline for sustainability and climate-related financial disclosures, or basically ESG standards. The ISSB is promoted and supported by the G7 and the G20. Within 4 months of existing, the first 2 standards were released for comment. The comments were deliberated for 7 months. The standards have since been revised and finalized and are set to be issued in the next few weeks. Next slide, please. The ISSB has offices in Frankfurt, Montreal, and Beijing. In addition to the 13 members of the ISSB with 1 chair and 2 vice chairs, it also has a jurisdictional working group with representatives from the EU, Japan, the United States, UK, and China, all to help align national regulations with this new global standard. Now, just before Christmas, the ISSB announced another new group, the Sustainability Standards Advisory Forum, with another 13 members representing different regions across the world. Canada is one of the 13 members. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Fund is also on one of the ISSB advisory councils for institutional investors. There's also a partnership framework to support preparers, investors, and other stakeholders. The partners include the big four accounting firms like Deloitte, Ernst & Young, KPMG. There's the Global Reporting Initiative, a whole group of UN organizations. There's the World Economic Forum, the World Bank, and the IMF. Now, if you scan the QR code on this slide, it will take you to the ISSB website where they've documented and recorded all of their meetings. You can review the documents that they've been reviewing at their meetings and keep track of the progress of what they're rolling out and how they're implementing things. Next slide, please. Canada is fully committed to the ISSB project. Canada lobbied for and received an ISSB office in Montreal, and it has established a Canadian Sustainability Standards Board to work in lockstep with the ISSB to implement the new standards. Most Canadian accounting firms and associations are in full support of the new standards. And I'm sure it's not because they're going to get a whole lot of new work out of this. Next slide, please. The Canadian Sustainability Standard Board plans to have 12 board members. The chair and the first 3 board members were announced back in April. This board said they will consider the ISSB standards and decide if they will be adopted in full or in part. The chair, Charles-Antoine Saint-Jean, told the Globe and Mail in April that he intended to open stakeholder consultations once the ISSB standards were released. If you scan the QR code on this slide, it will take you to the CSSB website where you can follow the news, you can subscribe to updates and whatnot, and you can see who the members are and what their backgrounds are and what their plans are for the future. Next slide, please. So what is this new global baseline? Well, within 4 months of being created in March 2022, the ISSB released 2 draft documents for comment. There's the S1 on the left, which is the general sustainability related financial information. And the document on the right is the S2 climate related disclosures. There's also on the bottom an appendix for industry-based disclosure requirements. These cover 68 different industries. These are the first 2 of a planned set of at least 5 building blocks that are intended to be interoperable with jurisdictions around the world. Right now, the ISSB is asking for advice on what aspects of ESG reporting they should do next. In the industry-based disclosure requirements, there are 11 designated sectors covering 68 industries, from consumer goods to oil and gas to agriculture to healthcare to consumer services. The categories for information that they require is governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. These mandatory standards are meant to be scalable for small and medium businesses. But to be honest, it's really unclear how that's going to work in practice for smaller businesses. Now, these global standards are designed for use across the entire economy, every industry, with a trickle-down effect to every individual, since all emissions must be accounted for eventually, whether it's by companies or banks or insurers. Next slide, please. So when the first 2 standards were released for comment, your very own Chad McPherson and Garner Diebold of the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association, Larry Thomas from the Canadian Cattle Association, Monica Hadaritz of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and a whole other bunch of cattle and livestock producers from Canada and the United States all stepped up. They submitted comment letters expressing their concerns of the shortcomings and problems with the standards as they were written. They also called for sustained consultations on the breadth and potential impact of the standards on Canadian livestock producers. This is really important, and I will come back to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Now, since the comment period closed, the ISSB has been holding monthly meetings either in Frankfurt or Montreal. At one of the meetings, Emmanuel Faber, the chair of the ISSB, commented that this type of standard setting normally takes several years of negotiation. There will be consultation, rounds of stakeholder feedback, and so on, but they're going to do this all in 1 year. This point was also repeated by Mark Carney at the November UN biodiversity meetings in Montreal. He said it took the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures 7 years to refine a workable and acceptable standard, but that the ISSB was working at light speed to bring in the new global language within 12 months. So why the rush? Why be so hasty to create something that will completely alter the Canadian and global economy, especially without even having a public conversation about it or a cost-benefit analysis? Next slide, please. So there are 3 key elements I'd like to quickly go over. The 2 standards combined have many problematic components, which I go into detail about in my report. However, this morning, I would like to focus on 3 issues. Number 1, the inclusion of mandatory Scope 3 emissions accounting. Number 2, the designation and reporting on water use and activities in high water stress areas. And number 3, the costs of compliance. Next slide, please. So first of all is the issue of Scope 3 emissions. The ISSB, in their meeting last October, voted unanimously to support the requirement of mandatory Scope 3 emissions accounting covering all 15 categories of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol value chain. The map of it, what the GHG protocol value chain is on your screen there. This is all direct and indirect emissions that can be linked to an entity across its entire value chain, upstream and downstream, from the making of a product to how it's transported, used, and disposed of after purchase. The chair of the ISSB was emphatic that all emissions must be counted from everyone along the value chain. To him, this was the most important element of the entire standard. So if you notice on this chart, Scope 1 is in the middle, and that's the emissions that you are directly responsible for. That's the fuel and energy, the emissions from you doing your operations. So the vehicles, your buildings, and so on. So those are the things you can account for yourself. Scope 2 are the emissions involved in the energy that you purchase from Sask Power or Sask Energy, and it's the emissions involved in generating that energy. Scope 3 is everything else. Basically, everything that anyone does must be accounted for because it includes how you use and dispose of a product. So, to give you an example, you as a livestock producer will have to account for the emissions involved, not just for your everyday operations like the fuel of your vehicles or the energy you use in operating your equipment or buildings, but also for the emissions of your livestock. What sort of methane emissions are your livestock producing? What about the effluents from your livestock? Also in how your livestock is processed once you've sold it, how the transporting of the finished product, refrigerating that product at the store, the emissions involved of the consumer taking that product home, the refrigeration of that product in the consumer's household, and the emissions involved in preparing and cooking that product, all of it. Now, that seems crazy, right? How on earth are you going to account for all of that different stuff? How are you going to know? So all of the different businesses and individuals along the value chain will also be accounting for all of these emissions. Therefore, what this does is create a great deal of overlap and more than double, triple, or quadruple accounting of emissions along value chains. So, as a gesture of goodwill and acknowledging that it's very difficult to try and account for all of these various emissions, the ISSB has decided that companies can estimate what these emissions are. But in making that estimation, it must be verified by a certified third party. You will also, if you're unfamiliar with Scope 3 emissions, have a 1-year relief period following the effective date of the standards to try and figure out how you're going to do this and how much it's going to cost. So, all emissions data, whether it's your Scope 1, Scope 2, or Scope 3, must have third-party verification. This is a bit of a problem because there is currently no agreement on how to measure Scope 3 emissions accurately. So, all of this information is intended for banks, insurers, and investors who will have to account for the amount of absolute emissions on their books, financed and facilitated up and down the entire value chain. So, in essence, banks will no longer care if you're a credit risk. Instead, they're going to care if you're an emissions risk. Carbon emissions will be the new currency. Next slide, please. This brings us to water. In the ISSB standards, it's required for companies to use the World Resources Institute Water Risk Atlas tool known as Aqueduct. And you're supposed to use this to account for activities along the supply chain that take place in areas of high or extremely high baseline water stress. The data used to create this tool is not only outdated, it's not based on the detailed local data that regional and provincial authorities curate and assess. Also, as was pointed out in the letters from the cattle and beef associations, and as you all know, cattle raising tends to occur in drier grazing areas that aren't suitable for crop production. The data also doesn't take into account the soil quality that holds water differently, nor the positive aspects of livestock grazing on grassland ecosystems. The standards also don't take into account the carbon sequestration that occurs from cattle operations. Now, as you can see on this map of the Water Risk Atlas tool, the main agricultural and oil and gas producing areas of southern Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta are located in high and extremely high baseline water stress regions. This means that activities in those areas will be highlighted, quantified, and potentially counted against entities by lenders, investors, and insurers. For example, a company identified as a meat, poultry, or dairy product producer must disclose the gross percentage of agricultural products sourced from regions with high or extremely high baseline water stress. They must also quantify from livestock producers the total water withdrawn and total water consumed in regions with high or extremely high baseline water stress. There's no room for context in this type of quantification. Banks, investors, and insurers will probably only look at the numbers and not necessarily on the meaning behind the numbers. Next slide, please. It's also important to note from a national perspective that Ontario and Quebec are not designated as high water stress areas. Therefore, when it comes to making decisions about limiting cattle and dairy production in Canada for the sake of the climate, as is currently taking place in the Netherlands and Ireland, preference will likely be given to producers in areas of low water stress. And that will be Ontario and Quebec, but not in Western Canada. Next slide, please. This brings us to costs of compliance. As if you don't have enough to do from dawn till dusk, taking care of your livestock operations, there will be a whole new layer of bookkeeping and reporting and accounting to take up your time. But it won't just be the cost to you of your time. You will also likely need to purchase some new reporting emissions accounting software, and you'll have to pay for third-party verification of any reporting that you're required to do. Your word will not be enough for the banks. They'll require a third party to confirm the veracity of what you've said. How much is that going to cost? Depending on the size of your operation, you may be required to provide your bank or insurer with a climate scenario analysis to assess ongoing and future climate risks and opportunities. How much will that cost? Some estimates range from $50,000 to $200,000, depending on where you source the analysis and pay for its interpretation for your particular business. The implications for businesses, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises and those companies in the resource sector, are staggering. Just to give you an example from the oil and gas industry, and this is a medium-sized company, Canadian Natural Resources Limited. They declared on their Carbon Disclosure Project questionnaire, that's the 161-page questionnaire, that in terms of staff time, software, consulting services, and third-party verification of their reported emissions, the cost was $750,000. The Carbon Disclosure Project announced at COP27 in Egypt last year that they were going to use the ISSB Global Baseline as their voluntary questionnaire next year. Now, the ISSB acknowledged during its deliberations of the comment letters and revisions of the standards that this all can be very expensive and overwhelming for small businesses. Their solution is to provide for a one-year relief period, whilst those who have to complete these standards can figure out how they can do it and how on earth they're going to pay for it. Next slide, please. So why should you care? Well, Canada has not yet implemented this global standard. And although Canada has said it will align its standards and work in lockstep with the ISSB, there is room for modification. In other words, when a country implements the standard, it can alter or modify certain elements to be more suitable for its particular jurisdiction. In fact, the Canadian Securities Administrators and the new chair of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board said they will review and take into consideration the Canadian comment letters that were submitted last year to the ISSB. They also said they will be, and I quote, conducting further consultations across the country on climate-related standards as they are rolled out. The goal is to have the standards reflect and fit the unique nature of Canada's capital markets, end quote. This means tailoring the standards for the Canadian context while still being competitive with the United States, which has not embraced this standard. So this is why contacting elected representatives now, as well as the current members of the CSSB, to insist that you are consulted is so important. The letters that the livestock and cattle organizations submitted last July were really important because it means that you have standing to insist on further consultation. Why? Because the unique circumstances of Western Canadian livestock producers were not addressed at all during the ISSB review deliberations. I can confirm that because I watched every single meeting they did for reviewing the comment letters, and I read all the documents that they had under consideration. Your concerns were not raised at all. So this is the opportunity to make the Canadian regulators know that you need to be heard and that your concerns must be addressed. Since the chair of the CSSB has said there will be consultations, there is a narrow window of opportunity to influence what is implemented by insisting on or pressing for fulsome and honest consultations. Now, I'm not saying this can be stopped. Unless there is a sudden change of government in Ottawa, this is likely to begin implementation in fiscal year 2024 or 2025, with Scope 3 emissions reporting potentially delayed until fiscal year 2025. And honestly, the accelerated pace of this adoption is outrageous. Resource development projects must go through many years of review and consultation before something of use can be built, whereas this new layer of tracking and reporting, which will fundamentally transform the entire Canadian economy, is being pushed through in less than a year. I cannot repeat this enough. Normally, these types of standards take 7 to 10 years to draft and get stakeholder feedback and all of that. But this will be finalized in about 1 year. This is all being done in a hasty way. Which brings me to the last point. What can be done about it? Next slide, please. Well, the first thing you can do to take action is to talk about it. That's probably one of the most important things you can do. Most people have no idea this is being developed and is being considered for implementation so quickly. Talking about it at every opportunity is super important. It plants the seeds for awareness that this is costly, it's burdensome, it's invasive, it's being rushed through. Maybe the pace ought to be slowed down a bit. Maybe there needs to be more discussion and consultation. Maybe a real cost benefit analysis is necessary. The second thing you can do is encourage your local Saskatchewan accounting and financial services groups to resist the more controversial elements. They could counsel more consultation and consideration. These standards have been hastily put together, and they omit key considerations like food security, energy security, and political stability. Third, you can encourage the Saskatchewan Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority to pressure their federal counterparts to not make Scope 3 emissions mandatory, to change the water stress component, and to not mandate scenario analysis. The fourth thing you can do is to encourage innovation and cooperation. For example, you could create your own producer industry emissions inventory to spread the burden of tracking and accounting of emissions. You could pool resources through industry associations like the Saskatchewan Stock Growers in order to commission a scenario analysis that could be made available for your members, if that's made mandatory. And the last thing you can do is contact your elected representatives. You can contact your MP, your MLA, the Premier's office, the Minister of Agriculture who's here today, or all of the above to ask for action. You can make some suggestions. This might include the province could establish its own Scope 3 emissions estimates inventory for some of the 15 categories. These could then be used by companies operating in Saskatchewan. This would reduce the cost for businesses, and there would be no need for third-party verification because it would be coming from a government inventory. You could also encourage changes to the water stress data requirements. This could insist on using local, regional, and provincial data rather than the World Resources Institute tools. You could insist that the difference in soil qualities must be taken into account, that the benefits of livestock on natural grassland ecosystems and the stewardship that enables sequestration on your lands should be taken into account. You could encourage that the Saskatchewan government create or commission a realistic scenario analysis that businesses can use for free and mandate its use by entities operating in Saskatchewan. The ISSB fears, and they said this in the meetings, they fear companies or regions developing their own scenario analyses because the ISSB prefers the use of alarmist scenarios from the IPCC. This would simplify and reduce costs for businesses if the government were to do this. And then lastly, the Saskatchewan could establish its own carbon credit certification registry to ensure that any credits generated can be used by companies operating in Saskatchewan. And this may be in order to find a way to certify carbon sequestration that takes place on your farms. If you're interested in contacting your federal or Saskatchewan representatives about this issue, you can scan the QR code and I will send you a contacts list of relevant people. If you like, I can also help you draft a letter to your representatives. If so, include that in your email. These are just some actions that can be explored to try and mitigate the worst of this new global baseline of sustainability financial accounting. But to be honest, this issue is really flying under the radar. And until more people hear about it, there will be little incentive to change it. I hope you found this information interesting and will speak to others about what's happening with the ISSB and Canada's role in it. I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have, and thank you for your time and attention.
Dr. Tammy Nemeth, thank you very much. Do we have any questions here for Dr. Nemeth here this afternoon or this morning? We do have one question by the looks of things. And if you could state your name, that would be fantastic.
Is this on? Yep. Richard Marlowe. Thank you for the excellent presentation. But I'm going to come at this from questioning the assumptions behind what's happening. And so your book that's on the screen here now, or paper, Counting Carbon Molecules, are you familiar with the peak oil theory?
Yep.
You are? Okay. So, like, I'm really questioning why we have to, or why would we accept what's being promoted as far as carbon emission, climate change, when you look at the resources left available, the known resources left available for oil and gas, like there's no way that the amount of carbon is going to continue. It'll continue to be burnt, but it's not going to continue to be burned at an increasing rate because the cost of extracting it is so high that it becomes burdensome. Like you follow what I'm saying? Like in order, like actually challenge the assumptions that are driving the thought process towards ESG. Like in my mind, this is about 50 plus years too late. It's like closing the door after the horse has left the barn. So if you want to be able to comment on that, or.
Well, the assumptions that are motivating a lot of this is that there's a global carbon budget. And at the Paris Agreement, they decided what that global carbon budget was, and Canada was apportioned a certain part of it. And we agreed that we would limit our emissions based on our allocation from that global carbon budget. The metrics and methodology used to determine what that is very shaky. And, people often make the case, well, Saskatchewan or Canada is actually a global carbon sink. We have all these forests and grasslands and various other things. And so there's no reason why we should have to reduce things the way they're saying we have to. But the thing is, this has all been averaged out. We've been given a limit, and we have to apparently follow that limit because we signed on to it with the Paris Agreement. But if I understand what you're saying, is that a lot of this stuff has been burned already. There's not that much left to burn, and it's not going to have that much of an effect on the overall environment. I would put forward that if you look at the global emissions, and I just had an article in the National Post last week talking about the net zero plan. And if you look at what China and India are emitting, those two combined are 30% of global emissions. Canada produces 1.7. So it doesn't matter what we do, we can go to zero and it makes no difference because China and India will not stop until 2060 when they even start talking about reducing emissions. So by then our economy's dead and this whole thing seems to destroy us for no apparent reason. We're told it's a global problem. If it is a global problem, then it has to be all countries working at the same time. And China and India and the large global emitters are not doing so. So it makes no sense for Canada to be going down this road. But the accounting measures, if it's brought into all of the different countries around the world, people like Mark Carney believe that this is the way through financial services to get the emissions down in the world, to make a level playing field. And I just don't know if that will work in places like China and India, or if it's really just going to hamper countries like Canada and the UK and Europe.
Okay.
We do have one more question here from this gentleman. Your name, please?
My name is Tyler Fulton. I'm with the Canadian Cattle Association. First of all, Tammy, thank you so much for making us all a little bit more aware of what's happening here. It's alarming, I think, to say the least. I guess I have a comment and a question to follow. My comment is that it strikes me that this is just dripping with irony here, that we as the livestock sector that make our living on the landscape and really is the key to a sustainable business, that we are quite possibly going to be, some of us will be put out of business due to the new sustainability measures that will be put in place, whether that be through the new reporting requirements or the water stress components of it. It defies logic that, you know, the very people that are working the landscape and have figured out the sustainable system that will do it will be the ones that will be shoved out the door. That's my comment. My question, I guess, is to what degree will there be a netting of emissions in the Scope 3 component? I think we all believe that there's, you know, a great deal of sequestration that happens on our ranch land. And have you seen anything that supports the idea that while we'll have to do these, you know, these additional reporting requirements, that we will actually be able to net back the benefit of having that cattle and grass perennials that are sequestering carbon?
Thanks, Tyler. That's an excellent question. I'll answer your question, then I would like to comment on your comment. There is nothing explicit in the standards that will permit you to take credit for any sequestration that happens on your land. I haven't seen it. It could be that maybe they want to bring that in because the next thing they want to work on is biodiversity and some other issues. But the problem with a lot of these, with the standards, it's all about absolutes. There's no place to put net in there. There's for example, if you were to say, look, I've got carbon sequestration happening, there's these benefits that are happening from my livestock and my farm operations, the only way maybe you could make a case for that would be if it's verified by a third party. What the banks will require, if they have to follow these guidelines, is they will just want to know your absolutes. And as I said, I haven't seen in there where you can actually include what your net is. It's all about the absolutes. And to comment on your comment about irony, yeah, that's the odd part, even with the oil and gas industry, is that the target is the companies, the Western companies that have been working really hard to clean up their act, to have the least amount of damage possible. There's going to be effects no matter what we do. That's, you know, whether you're a manufacturer or a miner or an agricultural person, you're affecting what's going on around you. That's impossible not to do. But they're targeting the companies that have done their best to minimize that damage. And the state-owned companies that may operate with less ethical, in a less ethical way, they will be unaffected by this. So they're targeting responsible, sustainable agricultural producers like the Netherlands. They are probably the most efficient agricultural producers in the European Union, for sure, perhaps in the world. And they're being told they have to downsize or get rid of 3,000 farms. It's outrageous. And it's, why would you target the farmers who have been sustainable and efficient. And they have met every single rule change that has come down the pipeline in the European Union for the past 50 years. Every time they've met and exceeded those standards. And now they have to shut down. So why target these industries that are being responsible and being sustainable, and others who are less responsible are getting a free pass? It's not right. And this is why it's important to contact your representatives and to try and change these standards before they get implemented, because there's room there. I'm not, like, as I said, I don't think you can stop it, but there's room there to try and say, look, why can't we talk about our net, that we're actually sequestering carbon, that we're, we should get some credit for our sustainable operations.
Okay, thank you. And we do have a break coming up here right away, and so we are going to have to shorten it up here pretty soon and do a shorter break. But we do have one last question here from this gentleman. If you could just mention your name, please.
Yeah, Henry McCarthy. I guess I'm asking you for your crystal ball, because these things tend to grow. So say everybody does just sign on because they think it's a good idea. What's next? Because this smells a lot like a social credit score to me. Are they going to move from companies to individuals, which they already are doing?
I think, yeah, I mean, crystal ball gazing, this is the trajectory, unfortunately, is that people will say, companies will say, well, I can't account for all those emissions. And the estimates, I think, are treating me unfairly. So if only we had more accurate individual data, then I could be treated more fairly. I sense that's the argument that's going to be made, once these things start happening, because however they estimate, and as I said, there is no agreed upon framework for estimating Scope 3 emissions. And it's ridiculous the amount of things they want you to account for. As a food producer, the fact that you'd have to account for the emissions involved in processing your livestock, and then how it's prepared in the household and how it's stored, and the emissions of the refrigeration, it's absurd. But this is where we are, and I could see people coming along and saying it's not fair. We need to, have more granular data of what individuals are doing. I know that Van City, the bank in Vancouver, has trialed personal carbon accounting. So they'll go through your bank statements and they'll tell you what your emissions profile is, you as an individual. So how long before that voluntary thing, you can sign up for it, becomes a mandatory thing with the bank? Because if the banks have to do this, they'll be looking at what their absolute gross emission numbers are, and they'll be looking to reduce them, because as members of the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the big banks, RBC, BMO, TD, CIBC, Van City, First Republic, not First Republic, but the National Bank, and so on. There's 8 big banks. They've all signed on to it. And the pledge is they must reduce to net zero the emissions on their books by 2050. And they have targets for a 35 or 40% reduction by 2030. So where's that going to come from? And how are they going? They need to know what everybody's emissions are so they can make those cuts.
All right, thank you very much for that. We do have to wrap it up here, unfortunately. I know we're kind of running a little bit behind time, and we do have to take a break here for Helium Evolution and Elanco Animal Health. We do have one gentleman that would like to ask a question, but can he email questions? What's the best way of getting a hold of you, Tammy?
Absolutely, you can email me. I think Chad has my contact information. If you go back to the screen where I put the contact your MLA or whatever, if you do that QR code, that goes to my email, and you can ask me whatever questions you want, and I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me and for your patience. Thank you.